Dragons have always been observed with a sense of awe and terror. They're great winged beasts that can swallow entire towns with their wings and spit flames hot enough to melt stone. When the people aren't being threatened by dragons, they can't help but gaze at them in amazement. Yet, there is only one that was so striking that even an archmaester of the Citadel had to admit it was the most beautiful dragon in the world. Sunfyre the Golden is as captivating as its rider is inebriated, but beauty isn't all that this dragon has going for it. When he isn't busy showing off his golden scales, he's busy killing, and by the end of House of the Dragon, Sunfyre will have earned himself a different nickname. But exactly how powerful is Sunfyre, and what will he do to earn said nickname? We're going to take a look at all of that and more in this video, so put on your spoiler caps because you don't want to be in this splash zone without protection. Before we get into our explanation though, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Birth and bonding. Sunfyre and the Dragon Pit Dragons. Before the reign of King Jaehaerys, the Targaryens had only one place where their dragons could create proper lairs for themselves, the Dragon Mount. The volcano that is the heart of Dragonstone served not only as a repository for dragon glass, it also became the site of dragon egg hatcheries and where the Targaryen dragons made their home for a century and a half. That changed when Maegor the Cruel commanded the construction of a great stone stable for his dragons, and the Dragon Pit was conceived. It would only be finished in the lifetime of his successor Jaehaerys, but thanks to the Dragon Pit, the Targaryens could now keep their most valuable weapons close to their capital city. Balerion became the first inhabitant of its cavernous lairs, which were said to be 5 times larger than dragon mounts, and Jaehaerys had 3 other young dragons brought to King's Landing to populate it. But with the formation of the Dragon Pit, 2 distinct generations of Targaryen dragons were created. The first were the pre-pit generation, to which Balerion, Vhagar, Meraxes, Vermithor, Quicksilver, Silverwing, and Dreamfyre belonged. This generation of dragons had its own breed variations, but all of them grew larger than any of the pit dragons ever did. 2 of the 3 dragons Jaehaerys brought to Dragon Pit were Caraxes and Melis. Although both of them grew large and battle-worthy with time, their growth was markedly stunted. Caraxes, despite being alive for over half a century and being the most battle-hardened dragon after Vhagar, was only half her size. By contrast, Vermithor was approaching her stature at the time of the dance, and had only lived a few decades more than Caraxes. Jaehaerys always kept Vermithor close to the Red Keep instead of putting him in the Dragon Pit, which could be a major contributing factor to its growth. When the Conciliator died, his Bronze Fury returned to Dragonstone instead of going to the Dragon Pit, like his sister Rhaena's dragon Dreamfyre had. The same was true for Alysanne's Silverwing, though she didn't reach Vermithor's size despite being as old as him. This was probably because she was a speed-type dragon as opposed to a war-type, but speaking of Vermithor and Silverwing, their births marked the beginning of a unique Targaryen tradition. Aegon the Conqueror, his sister wives, and his second son Maegor had claimed dragons when they were old enough to go to war. His first son, Aenys, was bonded with a dragon hatchling called Quicksilver in his youth, and Aenys' daughter, Rhaena, followed his example when she was 9, bonding with hatchling Dreamfyre. Rhaena's dragon grew large enough for her to ride it within 3 years of its claiming, but she also recognized the fact that her father had been sickly before bonding with his dragon. She came to the conclusion that the earlier a dragon bond begins, the better it would be for rider and realm. Claiming older dragons is tricky business, as we'll learn soon enough. Rhaena was the one who placed the eggs of Vermithor and Quicksilver in Jaehaerys and Alysanne's cradles, and when the 2 dragons were born, so was a tradition. Alysanne placed a dragon's egg in the cradle of her son Aemon, and many subsequent generations of Targaryens have done the same. All 5 of Rhaenyra's children got dragon eggs in their cradles, which hatched into Vermax, Arrax, Tyraxes, and Stormcloud. The princess lived most of her life on Dragonstone, so these dragons grew fairly quickly compared to their green counterparts. Prince Viserys received a dragon egg as well, but it hasn't hatched yet, unlike his elder brothers. However, this tradition doesn't seem to have been followed by Queen Alicent Hightower, and that's reflected in the fact that all her children's dragons were born independent of them. Vhagar and Dreamfyre had both been alive for decades before Aemond and Helaena claimed them. Fire and Blood takes special care to mention that a dragon age was placed in the cradle of every newborn Targaryen prince or princess, but fails to do so in the case of Alicent's children upon their birth. This tells us that unlike Rhaenyra, she didn't place dragon eggs in the cradles of her children, opting to let them find their dragons instead. This is why Aegon II's pride and glory was said to have been born on Dragonstone, and the prince was said to have bonded with it by 120 AC. Sunfyre's dragon egg must have been as beautiful as he's said to be, all gleaming gold with hints of pale pink streaked throughout. That he was born in the Dragonstone hatcheries is a fact, but what we do not know exactly is how long he stayed there and when Aegon bonded with him. It could have been 2 years or 10, Again, it's hard to pinpoint his exact birth date. What is known is that Sunfyre was young enough for Aegon to bond with by age 13, and without much difficulty, which is also indicative of its youth at the time of claiming. He was eventually brought to the dragon pit to stay beside the prince, but he was quite unlike any other dragon pit dragon in that size reduction wasn't much of a factor for him. Breed, growth spurt, and formative years. Sunfyre was said to be a young dragon at the funeral of Laena/Laenor Velaryon and at the outbreak of the Dance of the Dragons, but he was clearly different from the rest of the recent hatchlings. The Greens only ever possessed 4 fighting dragons throughout the duration of the dance. Helena gave her children dragon eggs, and in the books, her twins dragons hatched into Shrykos and Morgul. But in the show, we don't see either dragon, and her son, Maelor, who had an egg of his own, has been written out altogether. That makes Baela's Moondancer the youngest active dragon during the dance, and she's smaller than Sunfyre by a long mile. Sunfyre is also said to be older than Prince Daeron Targaryen's dragon Tessarion, which translates to "it's bigger than the Blue Queen" in Dragonspeak. At the start of the dance, Tessarion was as big as Seasmoke, who himself was described as being a third the size of Vermithor. Vermithor is the second largest dragon in all of Westeros at the moment, so the fact that Sunfyre is older than Tessarion and possibly Seasmoke as well means that it is much larger than both. Seasmoke bonded with Laenor Velaryon around 101 AC, and both rider and dragon were so young that riding wasn't a possibility. Both Seasmoke and Tessarion had about the same amount of freedom growing up, considering Daeron was sent to Oldtown at a young age with his dragon. If they're around the same size, then they must be around the same age. That must mean that Sunfyre is older than him because he is consistently described as being a huge and heavy dragon, and that despite his young age, he was a fearsome fighter. That huge and heavy description of his leads us to believe that Sunfyre belonged to a different species than the nimble dragons like Seasmoke, Tessarion, and Melis. In our Breeds of the Dragon video, we explained how there were likely 3 distinct species of dragon at the height of the Valyrian Empire. One bred for speed and agility, one bred for construction work, and one bred for war. Sunfyre seems to belong to that last category because while his actual size has never been revealed, we can tell from the clips we've seen of him from House of the Dragon that he's too big for his age. The dragons that are bred for war are generally larger than the dragons bred for speed, as Dreamfyre is nearly a century old, and yet she's nowhere near Vermithor's size. She looks more like Syrax and Melis in her build, both of which are confirmed speed-type dragons. So it's possible that it's just Sunfyre's species type that grows large faster than the other species, because dragons bred for war need to be large and have fires hotter than forges or kilns. War dragons aren't especially quick, but they're more lethal because you could rain arrows and scorpions on them and they just keep fighting. Vhagar's wings are evidence for the same. She's seen so many battles that the holes in her wings don't even heal anymore, but she can still fly, and is the second largest dragon in known history. Jace's dragon Vermax seems to be a war type as well, because despite being at least a decade and a half younger than Sunfyre and Tessarion, he was said to be large and thriving, and became battle-sized within about 15 years. He's definitely the largest of all the Black's kids' dragons, and that would make sense if he and Sunfyre came from the same breed. We know little of what Sunfyre did in the years before the dance, but we can make a few educated guesses. The first being that it grew up mostly in and around King's Landing, because its rider lived most of his life there. Aegon had been a drunk since his youth. He would often be found in the Street of Silk or Flea Bottom at his revels in brothels and inns and rat pits. He was probably not flying Sunfyre around for hunting and such, but given that it was a royal prince's dragon, Sunfyre must have been exceedingly well fed. So well fed that it became the largest of his generation of dragons, save perhaps Syrax. But unlike Rhaenyra's dragon, Sunfyre must have hunted by himself because he was said to be a formidable fighter, as opposed to the civil and obedient Syrax. Syrax was a bit of a pampered dragon, much like its rider. It's said that by the time of the dance, she hadn't hunted in years, as most of her food was being brought to her, and there will come a point where Syrax will acquiesce to being put in manacles and heavy chains. She never had a temper befitting a dragon, and she was always calm and courteous in the presence of people, but somehow we don't think Sunfyre would take so kindly to imprisonment. Dragons often tend to reflect the personalities of their riders, and Syrax, like Rhaenyra, was given everything it ever needed. Rhaenyra was the model princess, so Syrax grew up expectant. Aegon was wild and drunk, so it's only natural that that was reflected in Sunfyre. The Green Prince was said to have a fierce temper, being quick to anger and rather slow to forgive. Sunfyre must have gotten his attitude from Aegon, all temper and golden flames and claws whenever its fury was aroused. He probably had to learn how to fend for himself because his rider was usually too inebriated to spend proper bonding time with him, and That kind of environment can make a dragon fierce. Hunting is a major part of a dragon's life cycle. Animals that don't end up hunting become domesticated, and a domestic dragon is of little use. Syrax and Silverwing are the closest example to a domestic dragon that we'll see in House of the Dragon, and that'll probably be the extent of it. By the time the Dance of the Dragons broke out, Sunfyre was large enough to turn the tide of any battle that didn't include Vhagar, Meleys, or Caraxes, which brings us to our next point of contention. Sunfyre versus Vhagar. How does it stack up? What will happen in Season 2? Infighting is a common theme on House of the Dragon, and while the Blacks are clearly divided between Daemon and Rhaenyra, the Greens are going to potentially face a similar rift soon enough. In Season 2, Episode 3, we saw Larys Strong pit Aegon against his own mother and brother, and the previews for Episode 4 make it look like the king is about to leave his city in anger. We'll get to see the most beautiful dragon in the world fight in a war soon enough, so let's take a look at how Sunfyre stacks up against the competition. For starters, we just want to mention that he was the first dragon that inspired a heraldry change in the actual royal standard. Aegon loved his dragon so much that he turned the three-headed red Targaryen dragon golden, and in the TV show, the background has been changed to Hightower green. To be honest, we kinda prefer the show version, but that's beside the point. There are other Targaryens who ascended the Iron Throne and had personal arms of their own. Both Daemon and Rhaenyra had rather different personal coats of arms, with Daemon adding a gold treasure to his, and Rhaenyra quartering the Targaryen sigil with that of House Aaron and House Velaryon. We might see these yet in the show, but we're not holding our breath over it, let's just say that. Now, as for how Sunfyre stacks up against the opposition, if we're talking about every dragon born after the turn of the century, he's undefeated. Sunfyre is the largest of all the dragons that King Viserys' descendants bond with, save perhaps Syrax. Syrax and Sunfyre should be around the same size. In fact, based on the promo material, we think Sunfyre is bigger than Syrax already, but given their different breeds, he also has the potential to outgrow Syrax quickly. Vermax doesn't stand a chance against him and his best, and if Vermax doesn't, then expecting Tyraxes or Moondancer to do the same is madness. This brings us to Seasmoke and the rest of the bigger dragons. Sunfyre versus Seasmoke would be a sight to behold, the golden dragon against the silver, but we've already established that Seasmoke is smaller in size. Though it's swifter, Sunfyre is more ferocious, and if they were to meet in battle, we gotta think the golden dragon would emerge victorious. Now, let's move over to the experience section of the Dragons of the Dance, because this is where things start getting tricky. When it comes to facing Meleys or Caraxes, Sunfyre still has a chance. We'll see that soon enough actually, but Caraxes is said to be half of Vhagar's size, and Meleys is said to be lazy in her old age. She's fearsome when roused, but after patrolling the gullet constantly since the outbreak of the Civil War, she will be drained, and that makes her easier bait. Sunfyre is closer in size to both of them, and much younger than either. If the battle were a one-on-one situation, he could stand a chance with an experienced rider. Sunfyre is said to shoot jets of golden flames, and that will be extremely helpful in pinning down either red dragon because fireballs honestly suck. But given Aegon's inexperience and complete unawareness of how dragons work, we think it will be his dragon that'll carry the weight of their wars together. This brings us to Vhagar, and to be honest with you guys, no dragon really has a chance against Vhagar. At the start of Season 2, Daemon told Rhaenys to fly with him to King's Landing so they could kill Vhagar, because Meleys and Caraxes together could do it, but Caraxes alone could not. Daemon likes to simplify things and aim for absolute victory. He knows that Caraxes, half of Vhagar, but with Meleys he can nullify her size advantage. We don't think that Aegon would have the foresight to think any of this through if he ever ended up turning his dragon on Aemond, and even if he did, Vhagar would eat both of them alive. Dreamfire might have issues fighting him given her generally passive nature, but she doesn't even come out during the dance. So yes, while Sunfyre is large, mighty, and growing with every passing minute, it can only do so much in a battle against multiple dragons, which is why the Greens need to make sure that whenever they do use them, they do so judiciously. They're aware of their disadvantage when it comes to dragons, so you'll never see Sunfyre fight Vhagar, as exciting as that prospect is. Sunfyre the Cannibal. When and why Sunfyre started eating dragons. The Battle of Rook's Rest is the only official battle that Sunfyre ever participates in, and there he sustains injuries that leave him crippled for life. You guys saw how viciously Rhaenys attacked his neck with Meleys, right? A bit smaller and Sunfyre would have been air-axed, but this is where the young dragon's resilience outshone the elders. Sunfyre was gravely injured by his battle with Meleys, where Vhagar was not helping, mind you. He had massive bite wounds in his neck, and one of his wings was half torn by the Red Queen's assault. Because of his size, he had to be left at Rook's Rest to feed and recover he did, but not fully. Sunfyre was much younger than Vhagar at the time of the battle. With over a century on the clock, Vhagar's natural regeneration had degraded to the point she couldn't heal holes in her wings anymore, but Sunfyre could. After waiting at Rook's Rest for a bit, where he foils an assassination attempt as well, Sunfyre eventually disappears for a time. The crabs and the Bruins of Crackclaw Point claim that he took shelter in their pines and bogs, and this may well be true considering he would be rendered flightless while he recovered, but also cautious now that people were trying to kill him when he was down. Eventually, his wing would become good enough to carry him to nearby Dragonstone, which is where his cannibalistic ways would begin. You might have noticed that we didn't talk about the wild dragons of Dragonstone when we were making our comparisons in the last segment. It is true that both Sheepstealer and the Cannibal could make short work of Sunfyre, especially considering how wild they were, their size advantage, and now the fact that he was injured. But by the time he arrived, Sheepstealer had been claimed, and the Cannibal was otherwise occupied. He was born on Dragonstone, so he knew all the nooks and crannies of the Dragon Mount, but he must have tumbled into the wrong lair because he eventually found himself battling Grey Ghost. The smaller dragon did not survive the fight with the larger one, and Grey Ghost became the first dragon Sunfyre cannibalized. He would rest in the Dragon Mount and eventually gain enough strength to fly once again, but peace just wasn't written in his life. Sunfyre would end up having to fight another dragon associated with the Blacks soon after it regained its strength, and this battle would mark the second and final time he killed and ate a dragon. At this point in the story, most other dragons would have perished, so Sunfyre became the killer of the last fighting dragon on the Black side and lives the rest of his life as a cannibal. King Aegon's glory fights in 3 battles pretty much back to back without getting any sort of meaningful recovery time, but by God does he prove that he'll fight to the bitter end and then some. Sunfyre wins every dragon battle it gets into, and that makes him more of a warrior than Aegon will ever be. But 3 battles leave him battered and broken, and in the end, even cannibalism doesn't help him regain his strength. In nature, cannibalism is often a response to nutrition deficiency. Even hamsters raised in captivity will sometimes cannibalize their young because they lack the body nutrients they need to stay functional, no matter how much celery you give them. Dragons must be the same, especially when they can sense that they're at death's door. Sunfyre tries the absolute last thing he can to get the nutrition he feels is necessary for him to survive, but in the end, none of it matters. Death and legacy. Marvelous verdict. Though he won all the battles he fought, which were all dragon fights mind you, Sunfyre eventually contracted Khal Drogo disease in that his wounds ended up getting infected. That explains why he refused to eat eventually, but he doesn't die before making a massive impact on Westerosi history. This is a major spoiler alert, so if you guys weren't mad already, you're gonna be now, but it also isn't, because Stannis Baratheon talks about it in A Storm of Swords, which came out, check the date, in the year 2000? Man, we're getting old, oh god. But the point is, Sunfyre's legacy ends up becoming pretty similar to Aegon's in that he's never remembered fondly, with the exception of hard patriarchal men like Stannis. Aegon put him on the sigil of House Targaryen for just over 2 to 3 years, but all that's remembered is Sunfyre's beauty. Before his death, he ends up killing a queen, and centuries later, Stannis Baratheon speaks of that moment with his common-born counselor, Davos, as a reminder of what kings must do to retain their rights. Stannis has never been seen as a great and merciful lord. We know that the Manus' penchant for justice has earned him many fans in the community, but somehow we like to think that if he were to meet Aegon II, he'd disapprove. The lad is just too much like Robert, and not in any way that's good for the realm. Sunfyre's skull must have eventually been carried to the throne room of the Red Keep, because for all his mirth, Aegon did love his dragon, yet that ends up being his only redeeming quality as a king. That's all for this time, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.